We have our first dinner speaker today, and having the honor to introduce our guest speaker is Karen Hernandez from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Give it up.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see me. So my name is Karen Hernandez, and as most of you know now, I'm a theology major at LMU. And so there are many things I love about theology, and what I love most is how religion, faith, influences everyday life, whether you believe in it or you don't, or whatever you call it. And so that's been very important for me. One of the passions I have is trying to fuse together different cultures and identity and how that relates to us. And so this is very important because this is part of my interest. I am very honored and privileged to present our keynote speaker for tonight. Professor Davíd Carrasco descends from several generations of school teachers and artists whose commitment linked to social justice to the acquisition of new knowledge about arts and sciences. He grew up in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Mexico City, and spent the summers of his college years working in community development projects in Puerto Rico, where he discovered the historical linkages between colonialism, sugarcane, el baile merengue, and the café cuyaco. This diverse cultural background instilled a deep curiosity into the problems of social stratification, ethnic and racial diversity, resulting in a long involvement in the Chicano movement, the Mexican-American civil rights struggle. Professor Carrasco attended the University of Chicago and received a PhD. He became stimulated in part by his experience with Catholics, Protestants, Native, and curandero practitioners. After receiving 3 degrees from the University of Chicago, he was an award-winning author and teacher at the University of Colorado. He became the first tenured professor in the school history of Princeton.
Mexican-American.
I'm sorry. He became the first Mexican-American tenured professor at the school at Princeton. Carrasco's work as an historian of religions has focused not only on the role of religion in the rise of the first cities of the Americas, but also on the cultures and religious exchange in the American-U.S. borders. Carrasco is presently the Neil L. Rudenstine Professor of Latin America with a joint appointment in the Harvard Divinity School in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Carrasco was elected as a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2004 he was awarded the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, the highest recognition which Mexico gives to foreign nationals for their contributions to the understanding of Mexican culture and history. Recently, Carrasco won the Petra T. Shatlock Excellence in Teaching Award from the Harvard University Extension School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrasco.
Thank you, Karen. Actually, it's the kind of nerve. I feel a little nervous being here with you because I've been at Harvard for 10 years, and I've never been in a room with so many Latinos at one time. So I have a lot to live up to here. And so I certainly want to thank the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard University, and certainly Darío Collado of the Latino Leadership Initiative. For this invitation to speak to you about some of my thoughts on this notion of how to help the Latino demography contribute to a new democracy in the United States. As Karen said, I'm very fortunate to hold here at Harvard the Neil Rudenstine Chair in Latin American Studies, because this chair links the name of Davíd Carrasco to the name of one of Harvard's best presidents, Neil L. Rudenstine, who served as president of Harvard from 1991 to 2001. How our two names from disparate communities and very different life pathways came to be united is a long and illuminating story in itself. And I'll tell you a few episodes in my journey from what I call Mongo Street to Harvard Street. But I really want us to reflect together on this question: can the new Latino demography lead to a new American democracy? Now, I came in at the end of the last session and I had a chance to start to get a feel for this group individually and collectively. And I'm really impressed, as I said, to be with you and to get a sense of your talents and your commitments and your hopes. And I have high hopes for you this week. I know you've traveled from your places of work and your homes to this Latino leadership experience to begin fulfilling the program objectives. I've read the objectives, and I transformed those objectives to what I call the 3 C's. First of all, you've been chosen because the people at the Latino Leadership Initiative believe that you have, my first C, a tremendous capacity for leadership. You're already showing this potential, this capacity for leadership, but even you don't know how much capacity you have. And we're here to find out and help you find that out. So that you can, the second C, to build community, to build profound community, hopefully over a long run, a long time. This could be the beginning of long interrelationships that you will have with each other. And that's going to be crucial because any movement really needs to have a lot of people in it. And you're part of a movement, there's no question about it. If you're studying with Marshall Gans, it's all about movement. This is to help you in the struggle ahead to develop deep commitments, that's the third C, to what Marshall Gans calls employing strategic resourcefulness. Strategic resourcefulness. That is to turn your capacity for leadership and your commitment to community to develop new levels of participation in the democratic transformation of the community at large. So what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about myself, my approach to this. I'll mix some personal stories with 5 ideas that I have about leadership. Number 1, I look at Latino leadership in the U.S., to me it means, first of all, knowing what I call the secret ingredient of dialogue and innovation. I grew up in several places, including Washington, D.C., Maryland, Puerto Rico, and Mexico City. But most of my years were spent in Washington, D.C., where my father was a school teacher, a university professor, and a basketball coach. And in those years, Washington, D.C. really was what's called a chocolate city. But we Latinos were moving in. I remember my Mexican grandmother, Carlota Carrasco, visiting us in D.C. Now, my grandmother, Carlota Carrasco, was actually born in the northern state of Chihuahua, Mexico, at the bottom of what's called the Copper Canyon, Cañón de Cobre, in a little mining town called Pato Pilas. And she stayed there until some Protestant missionaries came in, beginning of the 20th century, with a message of sobriety and salvation. She moved to the borderland city of El Paso during the Mexican Revolution, but 2 of her 3 sons came to Washington, D.C. to work. So she came to visit us, and eventually she came to live with us in Washington, D.C. Now, my abuela, Carlota Carrasco, had this beautiful skin, unusually beautiful skin, even when she was in her 70s. And one time we grandchildren were with her, and we asked her, "Grandma, how do you have such beautiful skin?" This elderly Part Tarahumara woman who was a devout Christian, and she said, "Oh, I have a secret ingredient for my skin." Our eyebrows rose high in expectation, and we pressed her to please tell us the secret ingredient. And with her wise and knowing smile, she leaned her head forward and almost in a whisper said, "My secret ingredient for my beautiful skin is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics. Now, I tell this story to do more than just break the ice, but I want to set the theme of dialogue and complexity before us. For in the new demography that must be worked to become a better democracy, we need balance and new knowledge about social and cultural complexity, and we need the spirit of innovation too. So prayer, to me, in this story, points to tradition and legacy. Prayer is an ancient practice. Prayer is about tradition. And it puts people in relationship to one another, and it puts people in relationship to some other. Prayer is about the depth of feeling and understanding. It's about imagination in traditions that are passed down to us in families. And it's very important. I'm so glad Karen introduced me. It's very important. I can tell you from years of struggle in the Chicano movement. It's very important to recognize and acknowledge the role of religion in the families and in the communities that we live in. I can tell you at the beginning of the Chicano movement that I was very much involved in. It was really taken over by social scientists. Bless their hearts, they did a lot of good work, but they were totally tone deaf to the religious dimensions of the Latino community in this country. Except for very few examples, most of the early Chicano movement did not pay attention to the religious dimensions of people in the Latino community. And I think it's very important to recognize this dimension. But besides a respect for deep cultural tradition, which I know many of you bring because I can even pick up the vibes out in the hallway and in here, we also need good cosmetics, by which I mean technology, the science, and the innovations of presentation. I don't mean cosmetics in the superficial sense. I mean social cosmology, the knowledge of how social worlds are ordered and imagined by the people who live within them. So that when you're organizing these people, you know not just the social cosmology you're bringing out of your training, but you know how to listen and discover their cosmology, as well as their tradition, their sense of innovation, as well as their sense of commitments to deep roots that may sometimes be against organization for change. The secret ingredient of this story is the dialogue between tradition and innovation as a method for the new demography. The dialogue with the future, but also the dialogue with the past. You've got to have, it seems to me, both of those dialogues going on. Speaking of innovation, let me recognize at this moment one of our special guests, Mr. Joseph Tavares is here in the back of the room. Joseph, hold up your hand. This is Joseph Tavares, who's come here to meet you from Washington, D.C., where he is the Senior Vice President for Diversity and Innovation at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And he can tell us a lot about his daily work of dialogue between tradition and innovation, and between Republicans and Democrats and others as well. So number one, the secret ingredient of this type of dialogue. Number two, Latino leaders using the secret ingredient of dialogue between tradition and innovation. It also means knowing, and everybody here must know it, that innovation can come from the most surprising places that you don't think they're going to come from. It's great that you're here at Harvard, but don't forget something I always tell my students. You were somebody before you came to Harvard. Marshall Gans, he didn't come from Harvard. I didn't come from Harvard. I'm a University of Chicago man. Innovation can come from unexpected, surprising sources. As a Mexican American, I saw this dialogue between tradition and innovation in two powerful events of my teenage years. I come from several generations of Mexican American school teachers who saw schooling always having to do not only with the acquisition of new knowledge, it always had to do with social justice in the family that I grew up in. My grandfather Miguel founded the Smelter Vocational School. Here you can see the campus. In the early 1920s, right next to the border, right on the border of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, where Mexicans, the pushed out Mexicans, the dropout Mexicans, were schooled in trades of welding, carpentry, auto mechanics, electrical repair, cooking, to carve and try to scrape out niches for themselves and their families right here on this landscape. And you can see this is Smelter Town. Anybody know Smelter Town in El Paso? You got to get yourself over to see Smelter Town because they're about to take it all down. It has the highest and the most destructive industrial smokestack in the world was right here at this location. U.S.-Mexico border, as you can see it here, it's called a scar. Scar caused by many wounds. And I thought about my grandfather again recently when I saw a book by Jeffrey Stout, professor at Princeton, where I used to be. It's called Blessed Are the Organized, Grassroots Democracy in America. But he's got a chapter in this book, Blessed Are the Organized, and it's called Across Great Scars of Wrong. Because my grandfather Miguel, known as El Maestro there, whose teachings and support reached deep and widely into the lives of my smelter town Mexicans, was always dealing with these great scars of wrong. And it's important as you're developing this new style of leadership to be in touch with these religious meanings, because you're going to be dealing with great scars of wrong, you see, which you're not going to feel too much of it here at Harvard. But I know when you go back to your communities, it may be more accessible to you. Fortunately, this town and my grandfather are subject of a new book that just came out about Smelter Town. It talks about him and describes him by people who knew him back at that time. And it sort of makes me think, well, I hope they can talk about me that way someday. My grandfather Miguel. My father founded the El Paso Job Corps Center in El Paso, Texas. It's now called the Davíd Carrasco Job Corps Center. It's the #1 center of the over 100 Job Corps centers for 20 years in the United States for training and then locating people in jobs, in these kinds of jobs. He was featured in Time magazine for his work with dropouts and pushouts. It's an amazing series of stories of lives saved and turned around. But it was in this context of schooling that two events shaped me, and I want to tell you about these, that showed me that the innovation of new thinking comes from very unlikely sources. I call my first story my Aztec moment. Maybe you've had an Aztec moment yourself. I was speaking to Latino medical professionals in Mexico City on indigenous medicine and had a dinner with a group of Mexican Americans, and we were talking about our identities, and one woman at the table said something that was really impressive to me. She said, I have an Aztec moment every week. Not a senior moment, when you forget a name or a place, but I have an Aztec moment where I remember that my identity is linked to the stories and names and places of Mexico. I realize I'm not black or white. I'm mixed. I'm mestizo. I'm a mixture, and part of my mixture is Aztec or native to the Americas. Heads bobbed around the table because we all remember trips to Mexico as kids. People in our families who had Indian names or Aztec names. Parks and murals in our communities that showed our stories could be part Spanish, part Anglo, part African American, part Asian, but also Aztec, Maya, Tarahumara, identities deep in the American story. And this led me that night to tell them about my first Aztec story, and I'm going to tell it to you. I was 13 years old. I was living in Mexico City with my parents. My father had been invited by the Confederación Deportiva Mexicana to train Mexican coaches in preparation for the 1968 Olympics, the Olympic Games that were held in Mexico City that year. And so I was 13 years old. My tia Milena took me down to the Zocalo, right to this very place. How many of you have ever been to the Zocalo in Mexico City? Okay, everybody's got to go. How many of you have been to Paris? See, more of you have been to Paris than you've been to Mexico City. You've got to get yourself into your route. So she took me down here. At that time, the museum, the National Museum of Anthropology, was right down here. So I'm 13 years old. I go into the museum for the first time, and I look around in the museum, and I see these jades, and these pictorials, and these sculptures, and I see the calendar stone. I see monumental architecture. I see complex mathematical systems. I see beautiful feather work. I see poetry. I see the finest jewelry I had ever seen before in that museum when I'm 13 down there. And so what happened is I started to have this kind of nervous breakdown. I went out and I walked in the Zocalo, and as I was walking around the Zocalo as a teenager, I began to feel this struggle within me, this identity struggle within me. Because on the one hand, I realized after seeing these marvelous things that here in the United States, I'd grown up really feeling ashamed of this Mexican background and of this Aztec Maya world. I mean, if you wanted to study civilization, at least in those days in school, well, it was the Romans, it was the Greeks, it was the Egyptians, and Moctezuma's revenge in the halls of Moctezuma. And Mexico had folklore, and Mexico had some food, but it didn't have civilization. Oh no! And yet I just come out of this room, and I saw this museum, and I saw all this stuff that was telling me, pushing back against my awareness of shame. And I began to feel this tremendous pride. I began to walk around the Zocalo, where there's the National Cathedral, and there's the Presidential Palace and the Supreme Court. And even as a teenager, I began to realize I have internalized the lie. I've internalized the kind of self-degradation in terms of my identity, and that this was also a part of my identity. And I began to realize that if you wanted to study civilization, if you wanted to study deep things in human culture, this was as good as any of the other places too. And so this became my first Aztec moment, something that stayed with me. It stayed with me for many years, and I began to realize, you see, that beneath this world of contemporary Mexico, where the National Cathedral and so forth, that right underneath it was the pre-Columbian world, was another world that was deep, and it was civilized, and it was barbaric too. It also had a kind of paradox. Not only did I have an internal paradox of feeling pride and shame, but this had another kind of paradox. This was a place of great militarism. It was also a place of great art. And as I got older and lived through the Vietnam War, I said, you know, my own country is kind of like this country. It's got this paradox too. So this was a very formative and powerful experience that I had that led me then later, years later, when I got to the University of Chicago, when I had to choose the way I was going to go. I wanted the history of religions. And I had to choose an area to study. And I said, you know, I'm going back to my Aztec moment. And I became a scholar of this world, and subsequently became one of the leaders in the interpretation of the civilization that you see reflected here. One of the things I learned, I want to make sure you remember this, you see. I learned that in the history of human culture, there's only 7 areas where human beings invented cities for the first time, independently of all of the urban traditions. And those areas are northern China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, southwestern Nigeria, the highlands of Peru, and central Mexico. That Mexico was one of the 7 areas where human beings came together, cooperating. You want to talk about cooperation, organization. It's one of the places where people invented the first human cities, out of which all of the cities then evolved. 2 of them in the Americas. Most of them now considered third world. This really impressed me, and it started with my Aztec moment. You see this same kind of perception, and you've seen this Chicano artist where he's showing the same idea, but now in a different way. He's got this farm worker, he's got the Cesar Chavez kind of character, and right below the soil, what do you have? A sense of these deeper, profound roots that must be known and respected, because I'm going to tell you, it's a part of your identity. And if you don't see yourself that way, I can guarantee you the people you're struggling with, they're going to see you that way, and they're going to see you in a negative way. So it's probably very important for you to learn about this type of deeper thing. I haven't talked much about my mother. My mother is an Anglo. My mother is part Pennsylvania Dutch and part Kentucky hillbilly. She met my father during the World War II. They got married, and she's lived in El Paso for the last 40 years. She's bilingual, and this is her artwork. She does art, and she does art of the Aztec world and of southwestern images. She's come, in a sense, to be Latinoized herself, and affirms this kind of insight, this kind of Aztec moment for all of us. But at the same time, growing up in Washington, D.C., I saw my father do something that changed me forever and led me to the person that I am today. My father was the first Mexican-American to be a head basketball coach and director of athletics at a major university in this country. And I grew up on the campus of American University. And speaking of tradition and innovation, is it getting hot in here for you?
Yeah.
You can hold that door back there. Speaking of innovation and tradition, let me tell you, you won't believe this, but at that time, Georgetown University, George Washington University, University of Maryland, Catholic University, and American University, on their athletic teams were all white. I know it because I saw it. You won't believe it now. But my father was the first person in the nation's capital to go into the African American community and to go into the homes of African American peoples and recruit these young athletes. And he recruited these young athletes with a message: I'm going to help you get to the university, not only so you can win for me, but so I can win for you. And every one of those athletes that came, my father recruited at American University, and they went to the national championship 3 times. Every one of them graduated, because the message was that we are in this educational athletic experience for reasons of social justice. This is what I grew up with. And so by the time I was 15 years old, I picked up patterns and vibes from Anglo, African American, and Mexican culture. It taught me that going to school for us meant social innovation, a form of social justice, and the acquisition of received knowledge. But the twist that I'm trying to tell you here in terms of this idea of where innovation comes from, this wasn't the case of a Mexican American following what African Americans were doing. This was a case of a Latino leading African Americans in a struggle for this type of public recognition and excellence. My father had the courage and the knowledge from the Segundo Barrio in El Paso to take this kind of step. And to let you know that in terms of all of these people who played in these teams for my father, the coach, using that language, we're all close today. We're all still friends today. I know all these guys. They're all they're in their 80s now, but we all hang out and are in touch together still. That's how deep the thing went for us. So it was a Mexican American who was the innovator, the coach who brought a team together because he had a higher vision. It didn't happen without some struggles, I can tell you, because sometimes when this team was going to play in the South, there was lots of resistance. And I remember one time we were playing in Roanoke, Virginia, down there. And the team won. They beat these Virginia characters by about 20 points. And afterward, they were celebrating, and they went and jumped in the swimming pool. And the other coaches all rushed in from the Virginia team and said, "Coach Carrasco, get those Negroes out of the pool." So my father said, "You know what? I tell you what." He took off his coat and he jumped in the pool. And afterward, I remember something happened really interesting, because they didn't all have to drive back to Washington, D.C. that night because nobody would take him in the hotel. My father was there. One of the African Americans, a guy named Jim Howell, who became the first African American to referee in the Final Four in this country. Wow. He came over to my father and he said, "Coach, is there a Harlem in Mexico?" And my father said, "You know, Jim Beam, they call him. There is a Harlem in Mexico. It's called Veracruz." And what Jim Beam was really saying to my father, "Coach, how is it that you understand our condition, our suffering, our reality? That you have not only coached us, but you know exactly how to symbolically act in situations so that we can feel solidity with you." That's the kind of innovation I think is very important for us to realize, that you move between tradition and innovation in this way. I just saw a version of the same kind of story to kind of energize you. I heard someone talking about the drama and music earlier. I just saw, the WGBH, the program funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, recently did a story of Bridges, the Salsa Revolution. Anybody see that? You got to see this. It's a great story, and it's narrated by Jimmy Smith. And he says, "Man, what happened in terms of Latino music in this country, in terms of Latin jazz and black jazz? What we did, we uncovered our Latino thing," is what he says. And there's an incident where the young Dizzy Gillespie left a jam session with Afro-Cuban musicians, and Dizzy said, "Man, after I was jamming with these Latinos, I didn't know where to put my brains." Hopefully you know where to put your brains at the end of the week. "I didn't know where to put my brains." And that's the kind of thing that can happen with blacks and Latinos and Asians and Anglos can get together on the kind of leadership program that you're here with. Because when Cachao and Machito and Tito Rodriguez unleashed their sounds, they were, quote, doing something entirely different. And they had everybody dancing together. So when we use these ingredients of dialogue and make room for surprising sources of innovation, Latino leadership can remake maps of diversity and organizing in the United States. I like what Marshall Gahn says in his book, Why David Sometimes Wins, about Cesar Chavez and the California farm worker movement. He says you have to learn to think about things differently. You have to use your strategic resourcefulness when you don't have the resources. And one of the ways that you can think differently this week is to think about making a different map of this democracy and this map of your leadership. I like what Toni Morrison also says in this book called Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. She says she wrote this book of critical essays as a means of remapping American literature. She said the purpose was to extend the study. Chapters put forth an argument for extending the study of American literature into what I hope will be a wider landscape. I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography and use that map to open up as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration as did the original charting of the New World, without the mandate for conquest. Without the mandate for conquest. She wanted to do this learning, this intellectual adventure. That you'll be pleased to know that I had a chance while I was at Princeton to work closely with Toni Morrison. How many of you read Toni Morrison books? Toni and I worked together, we taught together, and I took her twice to Mexico City, to the place of my Aztec moments, so she could meet Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And if Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison can try to think new things, so can you. Now, this notion of remapping the landscape is also shown in this notion of this upside down Americas. When people see that, they, oh, Professor Carrasco, you got it wrong, it's upside down. No, I wanted you to see it this way. Because one of the things that's very important for me in terms of general intellectual orientation is that we get out of this habit of seeing the American story, the organization of America, the organizing history of the Americas in terms of an East-West movement. Stop seeing it as an East-West movement. I mean, I went out here and I looked at all the clocks. See, they got the clocks out here. And they don't have a single clock, man. Maybe one is from the Southern Hemisphere. Got all these clocks in the Northern Hemisphere. Get out of the Northern Hemisphere. Or include your Southern Hemisphere with the Northern Hemisphere. Go out and check those clocks. That's what this place is looking at. It's looking at everything in the northern part of the world. It's not all about it. It's about all the directions you can imagine. The story of the Americas has always been the story of people crossing borders or borders crossing them. And it's good for you to remind Barack Obama what he said in his book, Audacity of Hope. He said the demographics of America are changing inexorably and at lightning speed, and the claims of new immigrants won't fit neatly in the black-white paradigm of discrimination and resistance and guilt and recrimination. And so, speaking as an historian, I want you to look at this because I want you to think of the human interactions and the stories. You're going to be talking stories. Think of the stories this way, in terms of the Caribbean, how close Florida is to Cuba, how close it is to Mexico and Guatemala, how close San Antonio is to this area. People are not moving north, south, and east to west. They're moving in all these directions. And it's very important to start thinking of the connections that you bring in your own identities and families and your future, because this is the kind of way to think, not in terms of this east-west migration of people. And what we discover is that the borderlands are moving again as Spanish, Portuguese, and Creole languages, food, literature, art, musical heat, baseball players, and ideas migrate north and spread out in all directions. And the most powerful borderland today is of the cities of Los Angeles, the Byzantium of the future, the great linguistic, social, and racial borderlands linking the Pacific Rim to the U.S. and Mexico. New York, about which someone said recently, the good thing about New York City is that it's so close to the United States. And what I'm trying to say here is just to energize you. I think you all are ahead of me in some ways in terms of your preparation for this, is that it's very important to go as deep as you can and to take stands about this. It's not a matter of just coming along and saying, well, you know, we had the Scotch-Irish, we had English, you know, we've had Jewish, we've had Irish, now we're going to add some Latino. No, that's not what I'm asking for. An example of this recently was when Ken Burns did his show on the war. He did this whole thing on the war, World War II and so forth, and he didn't have a single minute about Latinos serving in the armed forces. And a number of people, including Joseph Tavares in the back and others, really got motivated about this and said, we got to stop this type of representation that has this little East-West story. You see? And so he said, well, you know what we'll do is we'll do a little add-on. We'll put little Asians in there, throw in some blacks, and then the Jews, and then we'll add some Native Americans and Latinos. But this is not about adding on, because if you add on, you still accept this East-West story. So you're just adding on. You can't add on. You've got to reconceive of the organizational history of the country itself. It's not about adding on. And if you don't want to join Morrison and the Latino Leadership Initiative, then just talk about adding on. But if you want to go deeper, then do something different. If we can use the secret, I'm in my fourth point, coming to the end. If we can use secret ingredients of dialogue between tradition and innovation, that's open to surprising sources of innovation to help us remap the history of these struggles, Latino leadership can carry out its huge responsibilities of linking up what I call the learners and the earners. Now, I want to say that word responsibility because, you know, we're going to throw around a lot this week the word leadership. Now, when I was coming up, something about me where people thought I was a leader. And they were talking about leader. I was, who are you talking about? It was you. So I was chosen to be the leader of this, and I didn't know what it was about me. But I learned after getting into some leadership roles that I wasn't prepared for, that I should take this word very seriously and very carefully. I mean, it rolls off the tongue. I'm a leader. I'm one of the leadership institute. You better be careful about being a leader. You know, there's a lot of bad leadership going around. And I had some experiences like this that Davíd wanted me to talk about somewhere I came up short. But I'll tell you, being trained in religion and the humanities, I realized a little late that I was tone deaf to the knowledges of economic growth and the importance of knowing the role of financial markets in Latino communities. Because I'd always identified myself with that borderland smelter town, where we wouldn't have no market. I mean, there was always a depression. You always in depression. Oh, we're having a depression, we're having a recession. That's just like always. And I had this kind of University of Chicago attitude. I love University of Chicago, that, you know, I really had the right method and so forth. And then I met a guy named Victor Nazario. Now, Victor Nazario was a Puerto Rican. He's about this tall. A little tiny guy. And Victor Nazario was an ex-priest. I'll tell you something right there. In fact, he was an ex-priest who worked with a guy named Ivan Illich in setting up this incredible sort of this think tank in Cuernavaca, Mexico. And he came to the University of Chicago, and so I was really looking for Latinos to hook up with, and he was older, and he was a professor, so I hooked up with him. And we started to, he started taking me around to where he gave talks, and I was deep in the Chicano movement. I was working in the barrio on 18th Street. I was running around, and that's another story. I was running around with a lot of gangs. People who were dangerous people who were hurting people, and I was a part of this sort of social working organization of these people. So I took Nazario with me a couple of times down to the barrio where he could give presentations. And this little Puerto Rican ex-priest, man, he wasn't afraid of anybody. And he certainly wasn't afraid of me. Because every time I stood up and talked in public, at some point, if I talked too long, he'd raise his hand and say, "It's just the opposite of what you're saying." And I said, "Is it the opposite?" He said, "No, it's 180 degrees from what you're saying, as a matter of fact." I said, "Man, that kind of hurts my feelings." So the next day I'd come and I'd switch over 75%. And I'd say, "Okay, well, today I'm going to talk about this." And he put his hand up and he said, "It's the opposite of what you're saying." I said, "Is it the opposite of what I'm saying?" "Yeah, man, it's 180 degrees. I said, "Well, yesterday it was 180 degrees. He said, "Man, you got to get this gringo stuff out of your head." Said, "That's what I'm trying to tell you." And so, I mean, we did things like, we went down, I introduced him. Before I introduced him, I'd say, "Well, this is what I'm going to say." So like Karen came up and said, so I go and introduce him, and he said, "Don't listen to anything he said. He's all wrong." So later I say, "Victor, why you told me before we rehearsed it?" He said, "Yeah, but it was something about the way you talk, man. I thought it was kind of paternalistic." So next week, man, I'd be really feeling bad, my ego hurt and so forth. And he come in and we do it again. This time, "Is this okay?" Yeah. Don't listen to this guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It finally came to me. What Nazario was trying to tell me was that there were other sides to my mind I wasn't paying any attention to. There were other ways of looking at things that I was just keeping out. I was censoring out. And I began to realize that just because, you know, you have a certain type of history, whether it's an oppressed history or a history that happens to be privileged, that doesn't mean that you know what's going on all the time. And this was a tremendous this was a tremendous value for me. And so this is another example of a Chicano artist named Magoo, who had the same idea before I even came up with this idea. How many of you know Magoo? He's an LA artist. The LA people should know him. So what I did, just to let you know, because Davíd wanted me to talk about this, I was introduced about 7 years ago to a lost Mexican codex that showed up in the hands of a rich Mexican painter. And I went ahead and was invited to interpret the map, the 16th century map that you see ahead of you, which is one of the great treasures of Mexico. It's been lost for 30 years, and they wanted to know if somebody could read it, and I could read it, and I organized 15 people into an interpretive team because I realized you can't do it by your one perception, one perspective. You got to have this team. And we spent a number of years with this. And for those of you who are interested in the Chicano history, this map, this 1540s map, which is a copy of a pre-Columbian map that I spent 5 years deciphering, this map has the most beautiful image of Aztlan that's ever been painted. How many of you know about Aztlan? Aztlan, well, here's Aztlan up here. It's the most thorough image of Aztlan and the drama of the emergence of Mexican ancestors from this place of origins that's ever appeared. And what's really interesting about this, that was completely left out of the Chicano movement, is that the Aztlan people who are coming out are led by a woman warrior, whose name is Obsidian Butterfly. Obsidian Butterfly was the hero of Aztlan who led the ancestors out on their journey. And I can show you more about her later. This is the other side of this map, which we deciphered. So Nazario, getting at me, told me, man, you got to work in teams. You cannot be a charismatic hero by yourself, thinking that you've got stuff to say. All of these things that are going to be meaningful are going to be done in teamwork. So now I've come to the end. I just want to tell you one more story. About leadership. I think if you do all these things that I've been talking about, you can help diversify the core cultures by working at the crossroads. And one of the reasons I started my talk by saying how good it was to be in the room with you, because I'm not usually around this many Latinos at Harvard, is that it's been a lonely time here at Harvard. I was recruited at Harvard by Cornell West, because Cornell and I were going to do this black-brown thing. The very first year, because Cornell and I had been together at Princeton. Tony Morrison and Cornell and I, we did all this stuff. And then the first year I came here, the president of Harvard really drove Cornell West all at the university. And it was a heartbreaking experience for me, because my values really were in line very much with Cornell West. And it's been lonely here. And about 5 years ago, I really learned what I was up against without you all. When Samuel P. Huntington, an influential sociologist, wrote a book called Who Are We? Challenges to America's National Identity. And through a couple of strange things that happened, Huntington said some things in public that I found really offensive about me and about Latinos in the country. And the word got out. And so we organized a public encounter between Huntington and me, which you can see it's filmed. And so here I was, you see, going up against this person who had been at Harvard a long time, very powerful, very influential. Maybe you know his book, The Clash of Civilizations, in which he tried to draw this kind of inevitable destruction between Christian and Islamic traditions. And he now, in his book, Who Are We?, he was taking the same idea and he was saying basically the biggest threat to the core culture of the United States is coming from Mexicans. In this book, he puts Mexicans at the top of every list of problems, at the bottom of every capability of achievements. And so we had this public encounter. And before I went to do this, I said, well, man, I'm going to do this, but now I'm going up against this really powerful cat here at Harvard. So I went and checked around with some people, other senior professors, and said, man, how do you handle it? I said, man, you got to watch out. I said, watch out, why? I said, well, he's a good friend of Donald Rumsfeld. I said, wait a second. You cannot warn me off because he's a friend of Donald Rumsfeld. These guys in Washington, D.C. In fact, the idea was, man, if you take him down in public, they come and get you. They come and get you. I said, well, I got my boys too. So what I decided to do was to do a combination of this kind of resourcefulness, strategic resourcefulness. I use scholarship and a sense of humor to do this deal with Huntington about Latinos. And he fell into my hands because he argued that the core culture of the United States was white, Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking Protestant with small families, and that they were being undermined, this core culture, by Mexican immigrants. Now what he did as a way of expressing this is he laid a symbol before me that was just wonderful. He looked at a variety of culinary metaphors depicting the nature of assimilation that had strengthened, in his view, American identity. He reviewed the metaphors used by scholars such as America is a melting pot, America is a salad, America is a mixing bowl, America is a weaving machine, America is a pipeline, it's a dumping ground. And then he came up with his own symbol for what the American culture is. And he said it was a tomato soup. Honest to God, Harvard professor said the best metaphor for American culture was tomato soup. Or better yet, quote, Anglo-Saxon tomato soup. He wants, quote, immigrants and their descendants to duly adopt the standard Anglo-Saxon cultural patterns. The culinary metaphor, he said in his book, is an Anglo-Protestant tomato soup, to which immigrants add celery, croutons, spices, parsley, and other ingredients that enrich and diversify the taste, but which are absorbed into what remains fundamentally tomato soup. So I decided to be strategically resourceful through a combination of scholarly critique and a sense of humor in this diatribe against Latinos. When I argued about his construction of who Latinos are, I suggested that the title of his book should have been, and here I'm playing with the title of a book by Carlos Fuentes. I said, Professor Huntington, I suggest your book should be Myself with Others Who Are Like Myself or Want to Be Like Me. And when I argued against his culinary metaphor for American identity, he chose tomato soup. I said, let me ask you, who's picking the tomatoes in this country? This is a project I work on. This is a project called Alambrista. It's about some of the tomato pickers. It's a film that came out in 1977. I helped to redo it into a director's cut with Edward James Olmos and Robert Young. So I knew a little bit about tomato pickers. I then said the word tomato, a word Professor Huntington appears to think has an Anglo-Saxon origin, comes from the Aztec Nahuatl term tomato. And the Cortez and the Spaniards ate their first tomato in Mexico. They didn't know, Professor Huntington, that tomatoes were originally cultivated in Peru over 3,000 years ago, migrated to Mexico, where it got the name that we use today without even knowing that it's a pre-Hispanic term. In fact, the most handsome man in Aztec society, I said, were referred to as Ixcuin Tlachtli, Ixcuin Tomato, something smooth, something like a tomato. Spaniards took the tomato to Europe. It migrated to Italy, where Italians made it their own as a pomodoro, the apple of gold. Only much later does the tomato, as word and food, get to Anglo-Saxon lands, where they did not learn much about the many ways the Italians had enriched its uses in food and art. So the real title of your book should be, you say tomato and I say tomato. You say, let's call the whole thing off. I said, Professor Huntington, the better metaphor for U.S. culture today is not tomato soup. It's Latino, Puerto Rican, or Afro-Caribbean Mexican salsa. What he and others were resisting were the capacities of these new Latino leaderships like you to build community and organize for the long struggle ahead. Commitment to what Marshall Gans calls, how David sometimes wins. When I gave the graduation address at the Latino graduation last year at the Divinity School, I said we were now in the Latino Primavera, the Latino springtime, where the surprises in leadership will come from Latinos like you, who will retell the social history and organize the new democracy, where learners and earners can be more fully nurtured by enriching and diversifying the core values. I can only wish you well this week in this amazing interaction you'll be having. Little seismic shifts will be taking place. I read in the New York Film Festival article recently that a new version of The Tempest was made about discovering a brave new world. Helen Mirren was playing Prospero, only as Prospera. The change of gender sent seismic energy never imagined through the play, altering its power dynamic. And I believe that with the help of Darío Collado and Andy Zelica and Donna Calico and Lauren Gray and Allison Shapiro and Marshall Gans and all the mentors, you're going to make your dialogue seismic and your power planning dynamic. Not unlike this sentiment in this poem called Oceans, about the arrival of travelers on a new shore. And it goes like this. I have a feeling that my boat has struck down there in the depths against a great thing. Silence. Silence. Waves. And nothing happens. Or perhaps everything has happened, and we are standing now in the new life. Have a great week. Congratulations for being here, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Carrasco. That was impressive. Would you agree?
Yes.
We're a little behind time, but we'd like to take, if it's okay, one or two quick questions. Again, identify yourself and your school. Anyone?
Carlos Pacheco from Texas University. You mentioned something that showed it's very true that the Central America has been one of the civilizations that's proven to the whole world that, I mean, it comes from hundreds of years that, for example, the Aztecs or the Olmecs or Mayans, they have, despite the time, had a lot of technological advances such as that aqueducts that dropped the concept of zero. When the Spaniards came and saw the city, it was very advanced compared to when back from Spain. What do you think, or what might have happened that, I mean, we've seen that the Romans, the Greeks, they brought a lot of contributions throughout the world. What do you think will be the big contributions that Latin Americans have offered right now?
Well, I'm writing a book about that, actually, so that's a really good question. But in terms of the first part of your question, one of the reasons that those contributions have been kind of put in shade was because when the Spaniards came, they not only brought this really superior military technology, but they also had this group of priests who made sure that the very worst things about the indigenous cultures were told and were magnified, and that many of the good things were put in the background as they were actually also mixing in some very impressive ways with the Spanish culture, so that the culture that you have throughout the Americas, and you know this, and whenever there's Indian presences that are not wiped out by genocide, that the culture itself is really a dynamic fusion of things. And so a lot of the things that we see as Mexican or Costa Rican, those things absolutely represent elements of the indigenous world that are still practiced today. They just happen, sort of like when you want to call yourself Hispanic or Latino. Hispanic tends to, I use that word too sometimes, that tends to favor the Spanish side of the story, even if you don't intend it, and I don't intend it when I do it. But Latino tends to have a meaning that wants to give more space and presence to the kind of cultural contributions that you're talking about. So those are some of the things I would say, but it's a very good question. Maybe we can talk some more about it. Yes?
Wellington Palmer from UMass Boston. How difficult would you say is to unearth a lot of these religions of these societies that were lost through Christianity and Catholicism being brought over to the New World and oppressing like the religious practice of the Africans when they were brought and also the natives that were already there?
It's an excellent question, and there's bad news and good news. The bad news is, for instance, as a symbol of what you're saying, when the Spaniards arrived really on the coast of Mexico in 1517, there were probably 5,000 or 6,000 of these pictorial manuscripts that have been created and used in the communities. Today there's only 15 that survived. So all of the rest of them were burned or destroyed. What happens, the good news is that indigenous people continue to make these manuscripts. The map I showed you was done basically in secret by indigenous priests who themselves are also becoming Christians after the conquest. But these things were often oppressed, the Inquisition was after them. Same thing with the African experiences. But fortunately, these people have a lot of staying power, the African practices. And people today are much more open than they were 20 years ago at finding the continuities and changes and the mixtures that are taking place. So I think there's a lot that still can be done, both in terms of dealing with the early colonial manuscripts and expressions that often showed, in a sense, the persistence, even if sometimes it was hidden. One of the examples real quickly is that a number of indigenous artists in Mexico made these images of Jesus, beautiful images made out of cornstalk, and you can see them in Chile. But they hid things inside, which people are finding today. They hid some of their own objects and their own stories inside the body of Jesus. So there's a lot of hope. There's where's Karen? Yeah, man, she's going to study this stuff. She's got a lot of future.
Professor, just because we're running out of time.
Sure. Yeah, I talked too long. I'm sorry, but
no. This is great. Can you just describe, I think, for our students here, the spiritual significance for you, especially in meeting Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor?
Yeah. So I met Darío in the fall, and first gift he gave me, this being the second one he would meet you, was organizing a visit to the Supreme Court, where we had a chance to meet Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who is a kind of, not only a human being, but a living symbol of a lot of things I talked about. We got to go there with a small group. We went in and met her. I cannot tell you how impressive she is. And in a very accessible way. First of all, when we were with her, she has a way of kind of leaning forward. I don't know if you got to sort back or what, but she leans forward. and she uses that as a way of meeting you and making you feel welcome right away. And so everyone in the room felt this kind of, she's leaning toward us. There's a kind of an accessibility and somebody who was there to aid us understand. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, somebody asked her a question and she said, kind of like my Nazario story, she said, what I have come to understand when I fail at something is that I always go back and see what else I could have done to have been successful. I don't spend time blaming other people. I try to go back and find out what more could I have done. And that really impressed me. Instead of somebody saying, well, I'm bad, I'm amazing, I'm powerful. No, she's leaning into it. And she's saying, I look at what I could do to be more effective. And I think that's what you're going to find this week. And so I want to thank you very much, all of you, and I hope you have a fantastic week. I have to go to Los Angeles, otherwise I would stay. I'd like to keep in touch with you. Darío has my coordinates. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have our first dinner speaker today, and having the honor to introduce our guest speaker is Karen Hernandez from Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Give it up.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see me. So my name is Karen Hernandez, and as most of you know now, I'm a theology major at LMU. And so there are many things I love about theology, and what I love most is how religion, faith, influences everyday life, whether you believe in it or you don't, or whatever you call it. And so that's been very important for me. One of the passions I have is trying to fuse together different cultures and identity and how that relates to us. And so this is very important because this is part of my interest. I am very honored and privileged to present our keynote speaker for tonight. Professor Davíd Carrasco descends from several generations of school teachers and artists whose commitment linked to social justice to the acquisition of new knowledge about arts and sciences. He grew up in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Mexico City, and spent the summers of his college years working in community development projects in Puerto Rico, where he discovered the historical linkages between colonialism, sugarcane, el baile merengue, and the café cuyaco. This diverse cultural background instilled a deep curiosity into the problems of social stratification, ethnic and racial diversity, resulting in a long involvement in the Chicano movement, the Mexican-American civil rights struggle.
Carrasco, visiting us in D.C. Now, my grandmother, Carlota Carrasco, was actually born in the northern state of Chihuahua, Mexico, at the bottom of what's called the Copper Canyon, Cañón de Cobre, in a little mining town called Pato Pilas. And she stayed there until some Protestant missionaries came in, beginning of the 20th century, with a message of sobriety and salvation. She moved to the borderland city of El Paso during the Mexican Revolution, but 2 of her 3 sons came to Washington, D.C. to work. So she came to visit us, and eventually she came to live with us in Washington, D.C. Now, my abuela, Carlota Carrasco, had this beautiful skin, unusually beautiful skin, even when she was in her 70s. And one time we grandchildren were with her and we asked her, "Grandma, how do you have such beautiful skin?" This elderly Partara Humana woman who was a devout Christian, and she said, "Oh, I have a secret ingredient for my skin." Our eyebrows rose high in expectation, and we pressed her to please tell us the secret ingredient. And with her wise and knowing smile, she leaned her head forward and almost in a whisper said, "My secret ingredient for my beautiful skin is prayer, 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 and good cosmetics." Now, I tell this story to do more than just break the ice, but I want to set the theme of dialogue and complexity before us. For in the new demography that must be worked to become a better democracy, we need balance and new knowledge about social and cultural complexity, and we need the spirit of innovation too. So I certainly want to thank the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard University, and certainly Darío Collado of the Latino Leadership Initiative. For this invitation to speak to you about some of my thoughts on this notion of how to help the Latino demography contribute to a new democracy in the United States. As Karen said, I'm very fortunate to hold here at Harvard the Neil Rudenstine Chair in Latin American Studies, because this chair links the name of Davíd Carrasco to the name of one of Harvard's best presidents, Neil L. Rudenstine, who served as president of Harvard from 1991 to 2001. How our 2 names from disparate communities and very different life pathways came to be united is a long and illuminating story in itself. And I'll tell you a few episodes in my journey from what I call Mongo Street to Harvard Street. But I really want us to reflect together on this question: can the new Latino demography lead to a new American democracy? Now, I came in at the end of the last session and I had a chance to start to get a feel for this group individually and collectively. And I'm really impressed, as I said, to be with you and to get a sense of your talents and your commitments and your hopes. And I have high hopes for you this week. I know you've traveled from your places of work and your homes to this Latino leadership experience to begin fulfilling the program objectives. I've read the objectives, and I transformed those objectives to what I call the 3 C's. First of all, you've been chosen.
Professor Carrasco attended the University of Chicago and received a PhD. He became stimulated in part by his experience with Catholics, Protestants, Native, and curandero practitioners. After receiving 3 degrees from the University of Chicago, he was an award-winning author and teacher at the University of Colorado. He became the first tenured professor in the school history of Princeton.
Mexican American.
I'm sorry. He became the first Mexican American tenured professor at the school at Princeton. Carrasco's work as an historian of religions has focused not only on the role of religion in the rise of the first cities of the Americas, but also on the cultures and religious exchange in the American-U.S. borders. Carrasco is presently the Neil L. Rudenstine Professor of Latin America with a joint appointment in the Harvard Divinity School in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Carrasco was elected as a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2004 he was awarded the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, the highest recognition which Mexico gives to foreign nationals for their contributions to the understanding of Mexican culture and history. Recently, Carrasco won the Petra T. Shatlock Excellence in Teaching Award from the Harvard University Extension School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrasco.
Thank you, Karen. Actually, it's kind of nerve. I feel a little nervous being here with you because I've been at Harvard for 10 years, and I've never been in a room with so many Latinos at one time. So I have a lot to live up to here. Because the people at the Latino Leadership Initiative believe that you have, my first C, a tremendous capacity for leadership. You're already showing this potential, this capacity for leadership, but even you don't know how much capacity you have. And we're here to find out and help you find that out. So that you can, the second C, to build community, to build profound community, hopefully over a long run, a long time. This could be the beginning of long interrelationships that you will have with each other. And that's going to be crucial because any movement really needs to have a lot of people in it. And you're part of a movement, there's no question about it. If you're studying with Marshall Gans, it's all about movement. This is to help you in the struggle ahead to develop deep commitments, that's the third C, to what Marshall Gans calls employing strategic resourcefulness. Strategic resourcefulness. That is to turn your capacity for leadership and your commitment to community to develop new levels of participation in the democratic transformation of the community at large. So what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about myself, my approach to this. I'll mix some personal stories with 5 ideas that I have about leadership. Number 1, I look at Latino leadership in the U.S. To me, it means, first of all, knowing what I call the secret ingredient of dialogue and innovation. I grew up in several places, including Washington, D.C., Maryland, Puerto Rico, and Mexico City. But most of my years were spent in Washington, D.C., where my father was a school teacher, a university professor, and a basketball coach. And in those years, Washington, D.C. really was what's called a chocolate city. But we Latinos were moving in. I remember my Mexican grandmother, Carlota Carrasco,